I hope everybody that is dialed in is having a wonderful day. I'm so excited. I woke up super early thinking about this webinar. Let me tell you what we're going to cover. A couple of things. As the title implied, we're definitely going to focus on critical thinking. We'll start off by talking about a definition of it. What does it mean? We'll talk about its role in audit. We will talk about how it differs from influence. So I know that some of you have been attending the webinars that I've done in the past, and they have dealt with influence and they have dealt with confrontation. And this critical thinking webinar is a build on that. It's a continuation on that. So we will talk about how critical thinking differs from influence. We'll also talk about a couple of ways that you can build your critical thinking ability. And we'll talk about behaviors that really hinder critical thinking. And they're little mental pitfalls, and I want you to be able to identify them so that you don't step in them. And we will focus on root cause analysis. Now, a couple of things. Lark had mentioned the polling slides. I want to be really clear. The polling slides that we are going to use are not your traditional polling slides. Sometimes we use them as a needs assessment. Sometimes we're going to use them as answers to case studies. But I just want to give you a heads up that we will be using the polling slides a little bit differently, but there are 5 of them. And if you do want the CPE, you do need to respond to all 5 of them. One other thing I wanted to mention, if you have attended the webinars in the past that I've led, you know that we distribute frequently asked questions, or rather the answers to frequently asked questions, several weeks after the webinar. And we do intend to do that after this one. So if you have a question and you type it in and we don't get to it in this webinar, no worries. It'll get sent to me, and just give me a little time, and we'll get the answer, back out with answers to all of the questions. However, we do intend to take questions during the polling time, so we'll cover as much as we can in the time that we've got. So let's start with a polling slide right out of the gate. Here's the question: which of the following defines critical thinking? Is it the ability to acquire and retain information? Is it the ability to analyze and articulate the merits and faults of a person, place, or thing? Or is it the ability to develop strategic ideas, evaluate others' ideas, and maintain professional skepticism? So get your thoughts in there. I'll just tell you right now, there's no penalty for guessing. So, give it your best shot. And it looks like we've got a lot of people voting here. And I think people pretty much have made their decisions. And they've made great ones. So let's talk about it. The correct answer is C. But let's talk about A and B for a moment. If you picked A, and I think that like 1.3, that was probably just a boo-boo. That's a technical term for a mistake. But that is actually the definition of learning, the ability to acquire and retain information. And that is important. It's just not equal to critical thinking. Frequently, when people hear critical thinking, they think about B, which is really being critical, not necessarily thinking critically, the ability to analyze and articulate the merits and faults of a person, place, or thing. So that's really not critical thinking. If we look at a technical definition of critical thinking, it's disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. The objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. So with just a little bit of background, I think my fascination with this subject of critical thinking began when I first got involved in auditing, which I wish I could tell you was just a couple of years ago, but it actually was like in 1984. Can you stand it? That's so depressing. Let's not dwell on that. But I was reading these different accounting journals. Okay, so that's a little geeky, I admit. But I was reading it, and there was a line that kept coming up over and over again. And the line would be, apply auditor judgment. Use auditor judgment. And I started thinking, where does this come from? Where do you get auditor judgment? I started wondering, is it a special genome on your DNA, that if you're a very special person, this is what you get, and therefore you're born with this critical thinking? And I started to realize, no, it's actually an ability. So right out of the gate, I would like to say to all of you that everything that we are going to talk about today is behaviorally based. And for those of you that have worked with me, you know that that's where my training is. It's in behaviors. So I'm not so interested in did you love your mother and hate your father, were you the middle kid, the oldest kid. I'm not so concerned about that, but I really am concerned about what behaviors are you demonstrating, and are those behaviors helping you or are they hurting you? And in the time we have today, let's focus on the critical thinking behaviors because they really are very, very important. Now, for those of you who attended the influencing webinars, I've got to tell you, critical thinking is the opposite. It's completely the opposite of the behaviors we need when we're trying to be influential. And this is why I think being an auditor is such a challenge, because we have to demonstrate skills that are basically polar in nature. Let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about with that. Influencing is the act of getting other people to see it your way. You have an idea, for instance, you think that the residual risk is too high. You want to convince other people to see it that way. You want to win them over. Critical thinking, on the other hand, is not so much externally focused. You're not trying to win other people over. You are trying to stay on a disciplined path. It's an inward thing. It's an inward process. And you're trying to cull information from people, from other data sources. Let me give you another idea of why they're so different. Let's focus first on behaviors that influencers manifest. When you listen to people who are very influential, in their language, they will embed the terms most, usually, typically, everyone, what a big word. No one, another big word. Now, if you think about when you write up your audit findings, would you ever think of writing everyone? That's such a big word. But if you're trying to be influential, you are trying to put out information that is going to appeal to the broadest base possible. You are going to basically emphasize data that is going to enable you to kind of enlarge the pie, so to speak, get more people to buy in. Now, you think about that in contrast to the behaviors of critical thinkers, and this is why I opened this section of the program by saying the skills are oppositional, the behaviors are oppositional. Effective critical thinkers cite specifics. They cite specific dates, specific amounts, and they look at data objectively. So I just wanted you to think about the change that you might have to make if you are inherently a strong influencer. To be an effective, equally effective critical thinker, you are going to have to use the other spectrum of your abilities. So now it's time for another polling slide, and let me tee this up for you. I'd like you to think about your experience, and I'd like you to answer, in your opinion, is critical thinking essential during the planning, risk assessment, testing, or reporting phase of an audit? You've got some choices there. Planning the audit, detailed risk and control assessment, that's when you're thinking about the inherent risk, and that's when you're thinking about the various controls that management has in place. Testing is that phase, literally, where you're picking your samples. You might be using full population testing and reporting. So you can make your choices there.
And while people are answering, we did receive a good question if you want to take it while people are answering. the poll question. Okay. This person says, I'm not a great debater. How does the skill fit into critical thinking?
You're not, but repeat the question. The person's not a great, I missed that word.
Debater.
Debater, okay. It's not about debate. The critical thinking process is a process whereby we are trying to be objective in how we are getting the information. Actually, the terminology around debate makes me think more about trying to be influential. When we're thinking critically, we are absorbed in the data collection and the data analysis. We are trying to make sure that we have balanced information. We are trying to formulate our point. So we're not yet even at that point where we're communicating it. We're a little ahead of that. I would say if I were flow charting it and flow charting the order of the skills, I would put influencing after I would put the skill of critical thinking, because you have to have an idea if you're going to influence someone. And what we want to do with critical thinking is make sure that we have really well thought out ideas. And that's where the critical thinking skill comes into play. So I think everybody voted. I think. Well, everyone that was going to vote voted. And it looks like, I think it looks like everyone picked G. That's what I'm trying to see there. And while critical thinking, in case some of you were wondering, well, why isn't it A and B and why isn't it A, B, and D, critical thinking is used in absolutely every stage of the audit. Different forms of it are used. So I would not say that you are wrong if you picked answers A through F. I think it's a question of you are most correct if you picked G. And so what I would like to do is just put a little meat on the bones there and go into that a little bit more. How can we use critical thinking? Because there's different forms of critical thinking. And if you look at this diagram, I've listed the phases in the left-hand column, and these are our generic names for the audit phases. In your methodology, you might combine a couple of these. You might call it something different. But as I explained before, these are just generic. If you focus, though, on the second column, these are a couple of examples, 4 examples, of different types of critical thinking. And this is why I mentioned that before we can debate, we have to formulate an idea. So conceptual flexibility means that you're equally comfortable thinking in a detailed way as you are thinking in a strategic way. Not everybody is. There are some folks who are just real comfortable in the details. And there are other folks that, my God, you give them the detail and it's like you're choking them. I mean, they can't take it. They almost run screaming from the room. The only thing that keeps them in their seat is their sense of professionalism. Divergent thinking means that you give a person an idea and they brainstorm off of that in many different directions, meaning they diverge. Their thoughts diverge. So they might get an idea and they might think, oh, is it useful? Is it interesting? Is it negative? Could it be applied here? Could it be applied there? That's the divergent thinking. Root cause analysis we're going to go into more deeply later in this session, but how can you audit without knowing what root cause analysis is? Meaning getting to truly what is the source and start of the problem. And then convergent thinking, you get an idea and you just dig deeper and deeper and deeper on really almost like grinding on that same idea. So 4 different types, and you can see in this slide the outputs, why critical thinking is just so important. Now, I think it's helpful to have a profile. Obviously, I'm a behavioralist. Of course, I would think it would be helpful to have a profile of effective critical thinking. So if you're working with somebody that's an effective critical thinker, here are a couple of behaviors that they demonstrate. With the first one, understanding the other person's point, we're really talking here about empathy. meaning being objective. Now, we don't need to cross the line into sympathy. I mean, if you do, you're not going to go to hell, but you're not going to be as critical in your thinking. And empathy, if you remember the classroom definition of empathy, it means understanding from the other person's point of view. It does not mean agreement. So we're keeping bias away. We're keeping our personal preference out of the picture. We're able to demonstrate professional skepticism, that trust but verify. Thank you so much for the information. Oh, by the way, where did this come from? Oh, by the way, how do you know it's complete? How do you know it's the most recent? How do you know it's accurate? In the third behavior, being able to articulate your position. So I don't really see this as a debate. I see this as a statement of, this is my conclusion. This is my position. This is what I would like to see happen. And then critical thinkers can support their decision with rational, with facts, I should really say. They have good reasons, not just, well, because I said so, or because we did it in the last audit, or because we always do it this way. Those are not good reasons. So those last three examples would be behaviors of thinkers who are really, they're not critical thinkers. They're not really being careful thinkers. I think the most important, and I kind of buried the lead, is the last behavior, responding appropriately to and avoiding errors in logic. And I think here, what's implied in this behavior is being an effective listener as part of critical thinking. Because I think we need to hear the other person out, hear why they're disagreeing, think about that. Do they have, could they possibly be correct? Where are they getting this information? Why are they seeing it this way? And those behaviors in tandem, all of these behaviors taken together, create a critical thinker. Just for a moment, let me just go to the dark side. People who are not effective critical thinkers, they get on tangents. They go off or they go down rabbit holes. They start on a path and they get lost. It's like they fall off the trail. So the other examples, I'm thinking about folks who can rationalize anything. They like the color blue and they give you a reason why they like the color blue. But then I also like green and they can rationalize why they like the color green. Those behaviors are indicators of folks who need to work on their critical thinking skills. So at this point today, we've defined critical thinking. We've talked about it in terms of its relationship to influence. We've also talked about its importance in the internal audit function and what behaviors constitute, like how would you observe someone thinking critically. So now that we know all of this, I think we're ready to focus on some specific techniques to increase critical thinking ability. And I want to take you through two techniques. And one is spotting assumptions, and then the other is root cause analysis. So interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but assumptions become facts for the person who is making the assumption. There was a very famous Odd Couple episode. I'm sure so many of you saw it. When you assume, and imagine the word assume, A-S-S-U-M-E, when you assume, you make an ass or a line, bifurcating the word out of you and me. And that is so true, but it's even more true in audit. Let me give you an example. Assuming that there's no problems in an area that you're going to audit because in the past they've not had problems. That's an assumption. And it's a bias that really creeps in. And one of the things that creates assumptions is known as the halo effect. And I want to do a deeper dive on the halo effect. I don't know if this concept is familiar to you. This term was coined back in the 50s, and it is defined as a tendency to make specific inferences, which is a really big word for assumption, on the basis of a general impression. So you see somebody that looks like they're really busy at work, and you think, oh, they look busy, they must be busy. That's the halo effect. Okay? You see activity, and you assume or infer that, oh my God, that person's so productive. You see somebody who comes into work very early. I hope I'm not stepping on any thin ice with this example. Or somebody who stays very, very late. Halo effect. Oh, they're in early, they're staying late. They've got so much to do. Well, that's the halo effect. That's an inference. That's not necessarily true. Now, let's take this Thorndike definition. By the way, he was a sociologist. He did a lot of studies, and that's how he coined the term, in case you're wondering about the derivation of it. But let's talk about how the halo effect can affect auditing. So what I've quoted here are some things that I'm sure you've all heard on your audits. Imagine, to set the stage for these examples, imagine that you're planning an audit, and one of the members of your team says, well, the management team and the staff are stable. So when we hear a statement like that, the management team and the staff are stable, we don't mean mentally. We mean they've been in their places for a while. Halos can come out of that. We can start to think, oh, they must be very experienced. If they're stable, they must be highly, highly effective at what they do. They must be so strong at what they do. The area's always receives clean opinions. What was the opinion on the last audit? How many findings came up in the last audit? You see where I'm going with this. Another halo. Just because an area was clean in the last audit does not mean it's going to be clean now. It doesn't even mean that the scope of the last audit is relevant to the scope of the current audit that you're planning. When management says to you, we're audited annually by you and every regulator on the planet, and this was never identified, that's a halo. So I think it happens a lot, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. I think that auditors are susceptible to halos, and definitely the folks that you are auditing are susceptible. So let's talk about what we can do about this. For those of you that I have worked with, you know I'm a big proponent of the critical linkage, meaning if you're doing an audit, I think I'm going to use a very strong word now, you must. In my discipline, I rarely use the word must, but I'm really intently using it now. You must understand the linkage between the business objective of the area that you are auditing, the business activities, the major things that they are accomplishing, the inherent risks that they face, and the controls that management put in place. And you need to understand these things in this order. The business objectives, not the control objectives, not the audit objectives. Those are derivatives. But truly, what is this area intent on accomplishing? I think that you definitely need to cite quantities, dates, and amounts, because there's no ambiguity. When I say something like everyone, most of the transactions, these are generic terms. But if I say 5 transactions, and then if I even ground it with a context, 5 out of 1,000 transactions, it gets much more specific. And so for the person who wrote the comment about debating, if we ground our statement in fact, there's nothing to debate. Facts are facts. Now, I'm making an assumption, which is a halo, that when you got your facts, you thought critically about them, and you asked about the source of the data that you were using to form your conclusion. And this is why, for those of you who are newer to audit, this is why you might get review notes. Did you cite the source of the population? You know, what report did you use? Where did you get that report? How did you know that that was the population? So far I've given you a lot of theory, a lot of definition. I think it's time for a taste. So I'm going to review this scenario with you, and get ready because there's a poll slide coming up. Here's the scenario, though. You're auditing an area that has had satisfactory review results for the past 3 years. Management is tenured, there's low staff turnover, and the systems and applications are mature and stable. Additionally, the auditees are generally cooperative and they meet their deadline. In essence, you can tell this is a fairy tale. Anyway, normally audits take 3 months, but your team, your audit team, expects this audit to be a breeze. In fact, they plan to celebrate at the local bar if it's wrapped up in under 2 months. Now, you know that performance is relative because you've taken this webinar. You're paying attention. You're hesitant to rush this audit. My question, how do you prepare to discuss your position that you're hesitant to rush the audit with your team? So here are your choices. Do you do a preliminary high-level review of multiple variables to dispel the notion of goodness? That's a fancy way of saying, do you brainstorm? Do you research similar business areas to find possible high risks? Do you review previous audits to ensure, that's another big word, there was no ambiguous language and that situation analysis was performed correctly? Do you do all of the above or do you do none of the above? So get your choices recorded and then we'll talk about the answers.
So, Anne, while everybody's answering this one, we've received a number of really good questions, and there's one that I think would be interesting to hear your take on it, if you have time.
Mm-hmm.
So this person is asking, where do gut instincts or intuitions fit within critical thinking?
I see gut instinct and intuition as all of the suppressed experiences that you have had that you can just not singularly recall. You know, it's everything is compressed. I think the mind is just phenomenal. So I would say it's one more data point. You know, and I'm going to repeat my definition of the gut instincts because I feel that they are compressed, accumulated experiences that we cannot singularly recall, meaning I can't say exactly, oh yeah, it was 1997, October 1st at 11:32 a.m. that happened, and I'm never doing that again. But I would respect it, but I would view it as one data point. Now when we're thinking critically, one of the behaviors in critical thinking is to be objective. So we would not necessarily want to skew our decision to gut instinct in the face of facts, but I view it as one more data point. So I think everybody voted. And it looks like we've got most people thinking that it is D, all of the above, and you would be right. Here again, you know, I think that answers A and B and C are good answers. I think it's good to brainstorm. I think that for B, I think the research, which by the way is a form of divergent thinking. You're springboarding out in a couple of different directions to collect information from different data sources. C, by the way, technically is an example of convergent thinking, in case you were wondering, did I have more examples of what these different types of thinking are? Because notice you're staying just with the category of previous audits, and you're going deeper into that. You're just staying with that one idea. By the way, I think D is the best answer. And if you picked D, you probably also like belts and suspenders. And you're just very, 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 very thorough. If you pick none of the above, well, I think we're just dealing with halos, dealing with halos. So I'm going to put the topic of halos aside and focus on the second technique. So we want to become very aware of our biases and our assumptions. That's the halo piece. Where are we making inferences that are really not on a firm foundation? And then the second behavior that we want to focus on is root cause analysis. And this is, I think, an important life skill because, let's face it, if we don't get to the root of our problems, we're condemning ourselves to experience them over and over again. I mean, I think you think of the classic definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and over again, expecting a different outcome. So the purpose behind root cause analysis is to get to and isolate the factors that are triggering the problem. Now, I think if we can get to this, especially if we think about risk, when we're identifying risk in an audit, thinking about the risk events, what could go wrong inherently, naturally, to threaten the business objective, if we pause for a moment and also ask ourselves, and how or why could this risk occur? What are the drivers of this risk? What are the factors that could trigger this risk? What's the risk cause? Will make our lives immeasurably easy from the audit side because we'll be able to more easily identify the controls and monitoring activities that should be in place. I also think that root cause is important because if we do not understand what caused the deviation post-testing, so let's say you did full population testing or you did sample-based testing and you've got some defects, if we don't understand what caused them, we first of all will have difficulty determining whether it's an isolated incident or it really is an exception. And more than that, we're going to have difficulty evaluating management's corrective action plans to make sure that it will do what it's supposed to do. Now, there are many different ways to identify root cause. I happen to include in this presentation one of the more obnoxious but yet popular ones, the 5 whys. And I mean, this reminds me of if you have little ones at home, if you have the 2-year-old, the 3-year-old, why? And they keep asking why. So it's a way you can let your little child out, but it also enables you through persistence. And by the way, another attribute of critical thinking, persistence, staying with it, trying to get your thoughts to converge on why is this happening. And you see in the example, we've got individuals have access to the processing system, and they shouldn't have access. So now we start pulling on the thread. Well, why is that? Well, because they, didn't have the appropriate security clearance. And why? Well, because the people didn't know how to delete the access. Well, why didn't they know that? And again, it has a reputation for being a little obnoxious. On the other hand, it does help us get to the source or the triggers of the problem. Now, I just need to warn you, the root cause is typically unflattering because it's either going to end up in ignorance, I didn't know, that's why we didn't do it. Part of that is it just was a bad decision. It was stupid. It was not a good decision. It was not well thought out. It could have been malice. Maybe there's fraud. Person is deliberately circumventing the control. But that's what that is about. So you got that example, and I think we need to see this in a case. So I'm sure you heard about the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And this is a little fable that we've got going on, a little story that I'm going to read to you. And at the end of this story, I just want to prepare you, there is a polling slide. So you're going to be asked a couple of questions about this case. So let's start. This is a case study in root cause analysis. So a man owned a small farm. He was famous in his town for the annual Spring Fest, which started in mid-April and it ended on Memorial Day. And the highlight of the fest were the camel rides. Adults paid $10 and children paid $5. And this man, this farmer, he took pride in his camels. Dromedary, by the way. That's a pun. Dromedary. Just had to highlight that. So he took pride in his camels, drum and dairy, a male and a female. They were 35 and thus considered senior camels. But they were in fine shape because he regularly groomed them and fed them the best hay, dry grains, and thorn bushes he could get his hands on. And they slept on fine hay beds. They just were having a grand old time. Really a grand old time. And then, on Monday of the last week of this year's Springfest, the farmer hears all of these yells and screams, and he sees a small group forming around a prone drum at the far end of the corral. And he saw what the problem was immediately. The camel had a broken back. Tragedy. It's really a tragedy. Horrible. Glimpsing a piece of hay entangled among the hair on the camel's hump, the farmer figured out it had to be the straw. What else could it be? So Drum went to the vet, and the farmer went crazy. He just removed every hail bale, scarecrow, and straw hat from the premises. And anybody who signed up to read dairy had to go through a rigorous inspection, kind of like what you go through times 10 at the airport. All straw articles have to be left at the door. So now here's the question. Will this plan address the root cause of the problem and prevent more camels' backs from breaking? So that's the key question. So what really broke the camel's back? The straw? You don't know, you're not a camel expert. Old age and a strenuous riding schedule. So I'm wondering, while people are polling, if there are any questions that we should be talking about.
There absolutely are. So one of the questions is, if prior audits are a halo, then does it make sense to consider them when doing risk assessments, and why?
So if prior audits are a halo, they could be a halo, but they're still a data point. So they should be considered because they are a data point. Let's say that there was a prior audit and they did have some issues. At a minimum, I think we might want to find out what the status of those issues are. We might want to understand what those issues are. We would, in the current audit, want to look at how far management has gotten with their corrective action plans. If management completed their corrective action plans, I think we'd want to test them. So I see the prior audit, and by the way, not just our internal audit, any regulatory reviews, any SOC 1s that were done, any compliance reviews as all data points, and I would consider them. So I'm thinking that we've got about 92% of the folks voted already. I don't know if anyone else wants to vote. And the majority of the folks, okay, so a quarter of the folks are like, I don't know, I'm not a camel expert. Okay, well, I respect that. And you didn't jump to any conclusions either. But from a learning perspective, from this classroom, webinar classroom, one might think that it couldn't be the straw. That proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was the answer that I was looking for. But probably the pure answer, honest answer, if you're not a camel expert, I could understand B. But I was looking for old age and a strenuous riding schedule, strained poor drum. So, in case you're wondering, there is an epilogue to the story. I didn't want you to think that it was going to have a tragic ending with Drum. Drum recovered. He definitely recovered, and he's doing much better, and they're both living happily ever after, and they did get a Tempur-Pedic, so they're really relaxing. Now, you might be thinking, what does straws and camels really have to do with audit? I really would like a more audit-related example. So I have one more case for you, followed by one more polling slide. So here's the scenario. 2 of the file cabinets containing sensitive information in the corporate compensation department are not locked, which is against department policy. And this is brought to management's attention, and as a result, they designated one person to lock the file at the end of every workday. Only this person was given a set of keys, and management retained the master key. So, here's the question. Does management's plan address the root cause of the problem? What do you think? Here's the polling slide. So while you're voting, I'm thinking, Mark, we could probably start working on another question.
Okay, we have, oh my goodness, we've been receiving a lot of them. So the next one we'll ask is, how do you help people develop critical thinking skills?
How do I help people think? How do I help them develop the critical thinking skills? I think it's easier said than done, and please don't laugh at what I'm about to say. Being aware of the need to change, meaning being aware that people, an individual, needs to work on critical thinking, is half the problem. I guess I'm not supposed to use words like problem as a consultant, but I do. I use those words. So, for example, if a person doesn't realize that their critical thinking skills are not where they need to be, then it's like you can drag the horse to water, but you can't make the horse drink. I think I'm into animal analogies today. But so my starting point is building awareness. And earlier in this webinar, that was why I included that information on what does good look like, the behaviors of critical thinkers. So the more we can get people to understand this is what critical thinking is about. This is an example of critical thinking. The more we can get people to understand, hey, how did you get to that conclusion? It's interesting. I do a lot of work with new hires, and I do a lot of work with people who are new to internal audit. And I was working with some folks recently, earlier this year, and they were new to audit, but very enthusiastic, really, really motivated, high energy, a lot of fun. And I was noticing, and I had to give them feedback, they were jumping all over. They were not following one line. So earlier when I mentioned the critical linkage, that's one mental model I give folks to help build their critical thinking. So it's how did you get to thinking about risks if you didn't understand the business? So there's a couple of ways. I mean, I give folks risk mental models, ways that they can begin to think about things. I try to give people progressions that they can use to discipline their mind until the behavior, the critical thinking behavior, takes hold. And by the way, critical thinking is something that can be used in life, not just in audit. So if you're working on building your critical thinking skills in life, it will spill over to your audit work. So the short answer is, in order to help somebody, in order to coach somebody in the area of critical thinking, they first have to be aware that they need to build the skill. They need to understand what good looks like. What are the behaviors, observable behaviors of a critical thinker? And then they need to be exposed to some models that will help fill in the areas where they need a little improvement. Isn't it funny, Mark? You ask me a question, the question's like 8 words long, and my answer's like 62 and a half words.
That was a very good answer, though.
Thank you. I think, though, that 93% voted, so we're going to go. And so we've got 20% saying yes, the root cause is addressed, and no, it's not, and I don't know. And so the answer that the root cause is addressed, it's so hard to get these words out of my lips, but truly, that's going to be an incorrect answer because we don't know what the cause is. Quite frankly, no is probably a conservative answer. If we knew what the cause was, maybe no would be the wrong answer. So that sounded a little confusing, so let me say that all over again. Since we don't know what the cause of this unlocked file cabinet is, the correct answer is C. I think if you're conservative, intuitively you would say, no, the problem that what they're going to do with that key is not going to work. just because based on my experience, it's a manual control. Maybe you had some logic behind it. But from an accuracy perspective, we don't really know. We don't know what is the root of the problem. So we would have to dig a little bit more to find out what the source is. There are a couple of reasons why that file cabinet might have been unlocked. Keys were lost and they were never replaced. Maybe it was an ignorance thing. People didn't know. They just were unaware. Maybe it was a question of responsibilities. Roles were not established. So what I'm getting at here, folks, is from an audit perspective, when you see what you feel is a deviation or a defect, your natural reaction as a critical thinker should be to explore that. Dig a little deeper, collect more information so that we get the best response. So we're at the point where I've managed to leave, it looks like about 10 minutes for some questions. And I'm going to say to Lark, do you have one that you want to ask?
I do. There's one. Well, we have a lot. Excuse me. We have a lot we could ask. The one we'll start with is: are universities teaching critical thinking courses as part of their accounting and audit programs?
I'm sorry, I lost part of those words. Say again.
Sorry about that. The question is: are universities teaching critical thinking courses as part of their accounting or audit programs?
I really don't know. I am not an academic. I would love to think that the schools that I am particularly thinking about, LSU, that's very tight with the audit community, but I don't know the answer. I would love to think they stay so tightly woven with the audit community that it would make sense. But I just don't see this skill as something that only auditors need. I mean, I think that accountants need this. I think that salespeople need this. I think that attorneys need this. I mean, I think critical thinking is, no pun intended, a critical behavior that we all need if we're going to make sound, fact-based decisions. But I just don't know. So that might be something we could reach out and find out.
That sounds good. So the next question is, how can influencers not be critical thinkers when it appears that that being a critical thinker is an integral part of being an influencer? So you touched on this earlier in the webinar, that they're two separate concepts.
Yeah, I think that they are both important. I think it's important to be a critical thinker, and it's important to be an influencer. I think that people who are inherently effective at critical thinking, meaning they don't jump to judgment, they are not put off by dense or complicated information, they will not be rushed, they will give each data point consideration, they will remain objective, no jump to judgment. These are the behaviors of a critical thinker. Critical thinkers choose their words carefully. Critical thinkers listen carefully. Now, when we move to the influencing part, we have a concept. I would love to think we got the concept out of our critical thinking, but some people who are very influential are not inherently good critical thinkers. People who are inherently good influencers tend to read people. They tend to play off the intuitive side and use more general terms to gain that agreement. So I think that both are very important. My only point was that if you are inherently a good influencer, you might find it a little tedious to be a critical thinker because you have to stay with it. You can't just say, hey, it looks right, let's go. And conversely, if you're inherently a good critical thinker, you're very methodical, almost plotting, you're very disciplined, you might find it hard to think on your seat, and really have that verbal agility that high influencers have. But I definitely think they're both needed. There's no question about that. If I were creating my profile of the Uber auditor, the Uber compliance person, the Uber risk management person, I would have both of those behaviors definitely in the profile. Definitely in the profile. Just one comment, Mark, before you answer the next question. I want to repeat something that I said earlier. It is 30 days to a behavioral change. And so what you're looking at, these final thoughts, what will you change to increase your thinking ability, your critical thinking ability? Some of you know I'm a maniacal tennis player, and I think you can always lift your game. No matter how good you are, you can always take your game to the next level. And so I'm just throwing out there, what are you going to do or do differently? What are you going to start doing? What are you going to continue doing? And you might be coming out of this webinar thinking, wow, I do a lot of those things. Well, that's great. I think that's great. What are you going to do to lift your game to the next level? Or alternatively, what are you going to stop doing that is getting in the way of your ability to think critically? If you get review notes, hey, I show your work, you kind of jumped here. Even if your conclusion is right, in audit, we do need to document our work. We are subject to that reperformance standard. So even if you got the right answer, you have to show your work. That's just part of this profession. I just wanted to get that out. But I think we have time for one more question. I think we've got about 4 minutes left.
Okay, great. This is a good closing question, and it is, how do you find time for critical thinking, especially when you operate in a lean organization? It seems like when you were talking earlier, Ann, brainstorming and taking the time to think in a right way, examine all the different data points is important. So how do you find the time to do that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's a good point, because when you're thinking, if you're thinking and you're sitting at your desk, and, with your chin propped up by your hands, staring into space, and your boss walks by, it's going to look like you are doing nothing. It's going to look like, what is this person doing? Because it is such a silent activity as you're mulling things over. My answer to the question will probably be, I hope not, but it might be a little unpopular. I do my best thinking when I'm not in the office. I do my best thinking, and these ideas will come to me in the shower. Do you know what I mean? I'll be commuting, and all of a sudden these thoughts will just kind of connect. And the thoughts that are connecting are thoughts, conclusionary thoughts, or answers to the question, what does this mean? What does this mean? What should we be recommending? What are the themes and the issues, that we're finding in this project? What's tying these issues together? What should our opinion be? These kinds of questions, I find, either come out at odd times, or if you do have the luxury to have, if you're not just auditing by yourself, if you have the luxury to have somebody else on your team, you could discuss it 15, 20 minutes, get some ideas out there. It can really help. But I don't think that we can complete our audit without thinking critically, because otherwise we're just going to be doing these drive-by audits. Checking the box, checking the box, checking the box, boom, done. And I don't really think that's adding the value that we need to add, nor is that adding the value that I think management expects and the audit committee expects of us.
Thank you for that, Ann, and thank you for taking the time today to present on this topic. We did receive a number of questions, so we will be following up with you. And thank you, everybody, for attending today. We hope you enjoyed it. There is a quick survey that you can fill out when you exit the webinar. We like to get your feedback and your comments, and if you have ideas on future topics you'd like to hear more about on our webinar series, the more information you give us, the better. So have a great day.